Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second part of the series, the actual fourth session of our trainings from Heartset, Ryan and Khalil. And I'm not going to take up any more of their precious time. Go ahead and get signed in, say hi in the chat if you want to. And I'm just going to turn it over to our friends, Ryan and Khalil.
Thanks so much, Laura. Getting the slides up right now. We're so excited to be back with you all for the second month of this kind of long series with us. We're Heartset Training Center. We're a fairly new organization aimed at providing support to helpers, especially in the supportive housing spaces. As with things like housing first, harm reduction, and other practices, motivational interviewing is just a key strategy that I think we all need in our tool belts. So we want to kind of spend the next 3 sessions that we'll be with you on some skills around motivational interviewing. We want it to be concrete and helpful to your practices. So we'll try and build in a little bit of practice as we go, and just get you out of here feeling like you have some tools in your tool belt. So I'm Ryan Villagran. I use they and them pronouns, and my background is mostly in mental health and co-occurring disorder spaces. And so my practice with motivational interviewing really comes out of those spaces, especially like day programs and psych programs, and helping people kind of gather themselves around their own values and goals and helping moving them in those directions, right? Rather than trying to get people to do what we want them to do as a program. So that's my background. I'll have my co-facilitator, co-founder of Heartset introduce himself, and then we'll get going.
Hi, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm excited to talk about motivational interviewing today. My background is in like the homelessness space, mental health, and substance use. Really love to have these conversations. And I also want to let folks know that my power is completely out. We're having some pretty intense wind. There's some trucks outside doing some stuff, but we'll try to troubleshoot if I drop off. Yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to hit you with some quick shared expectations that we have. We want you to engage with us, right? We don't love speaking into the void and talking to an audience that we're not sure is there. And so if you are able to, we'd love that you just engage with us. We're going to ask a number of questions as we go. Asking you to define things for yourself and asking about your own practice. And we would love it if you would use the chat to chime in, share your expertise. We really value your expertise. I think we come in as trainers not thinking that we have the answers, but I do think we come in hopefully with the ability to help you synthesize some of this information into just more growth for you in your practice, right? So please engage in dialogue with us. We think that maybe there will be times where you don't agree with what we have to say, and we want to hear that too, right? We love a little bit of critical feedback or pushback, or for you to say, you know what, I tried that thing and it never worked. And here's what my experience is of what works. So we're just inviting that. That's not going to hurt our feelings. We love to dialogue in those ways. Sometimes, though, that dialogue will get long. And so I do want to make sure that we're just mindful of time. We have a kind of a tight hour and a half to get through a lot of stuff in each of these sessions. And so there may be times where we'll move us along, and we don't mean to kind of shut you down, but we just are saying up top that sometimes just for the benefit of getting through all of our content, we'll be moving us along gently. And then lastly, we are going to drop a link to a session evaluation at the end of this session. I know that the Coalition for the Homeless also does their own session evaluations. So there are 2, and we just invite you to help us understand what you thought about this training content and our delivery style, and maybe whether it was helpful to you in your practice. So we'll drop that link, and if you follow that link to our session evaluation, you'll have an opportunity to put your email address in there, and we can follow up directly with some materials, including a copy of the slides to your email. So you can expect us to follow up with you with some extra materials if you complete our session evaluation. You'll also get an attendance certificate, by the way. All right, let's get into it. Looking at some objectives. By the end of this 1.5 hour session, we want you to be able to describe the spirit of motivational interviewing. And that's a kind of a key term in motivational interviewing, the spirit, or like the way that we approach the work. So I want you to be able to describe that. We also want you to be able to identify change talk and sustain talk in a specific client scenario. And so this identification of change talk and sustain talk is a key concept in motivational interviewing that I think we're not going to be able to support people in moving towards their goals unless we clearly understand what we're hearing them say. And then finally, we want you to be able to list at least 3 strategies for dealing with barriers to client change that are centered in us, the helper, right? There are some barriers that are going to come up while we engage in motivational interviewing practice that we sort of need to get out of our own way to support people through. So those are our objectives. Here's how we're going to get there. Here's the kind of map that we're going to follow. We're going to spend a little time unpacking motivation. What is motivation? How do we get people motivated? How do we ourselves become motivated to our own goals? We also want to kind of just very briefly touch on a history of motivational interviewing and like where it sits as a practice kind of here in the year 2025. We'll then spend some time understanding the concept of ambivalence, which we all face. It's a typical and normal part of change. And I want to be able to center that in our client experiences. And we'll take a little time to practice listening for change talk. We have a little engagement activity that we want to kind of ask you to use the chat to move through. We'll practice getting out of our own way. We'll have some time for questions, and then we'll get you on out of here. That's our plan. Laura, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to add something there?
Oh, no, I did not mean to unmute myself.
Oh, okay. No worries. Just trying to be responsive here. All right, so I'm going to pass the mic over to Khalil and this beautiful photo of Gene Wilder, who's one of my faves. Take it away, Khalil.
Yes. So, what I'm going to do is ask you to use your imagination, right? That's the reason for this image here. I guess a good image doesn't need like an explanation, but anyway, you actually might not have to imagine too much because these might sound like some participant scenarios you've encountered in your own work. But I also want to share that as unbelievable as some of these might be, one in particular that I think about, these are some very first housing first examples that I've experienced in my housing first work. So I would love for you to think about a client who, despite communicating her frustrations of street homelessness, refuses to sign the paperwork required to house her. Maybe that sounds familiar. You can't get clients in to sign paperwork to do a really cool, big thing that will maybe change their lives in some really cool ways, right? And they won't do it, even though they're like, ah, I hate my current situation, right? And you also might have, in the substance use space, had clients who've had like an amputee, right, related to their substance use. So imagine a client who's had their leg amputated due to their IV substance use, and is expressing fear over the growing wound on their arm, thinking maybe I'm gonna have another limb amputated, right? But still, they don't show up for their wound care appointments, right? So they don't want to have another amputation, but aren't taking the step to kind of prevent them from actually preventing that next or potential amputation. And maybe you've worked with clients who really want to remain housed, but continue breaking their windows and breaking into their home because they get locked out or they lose their keys on a very consistent basis, right? And this one, our clients are so unbelievably resilient sometimes. But maybe you've had a client who has fallen into the train tracks or has been hit by a train as a result of their substance use, right? And in your next treatment planning session, they tell you, I don't have any goals, right? You're like, what? Not even to like not get hit by a train again? That can't be like one of your goals, right? Ryan, we can put that last bullet up if you can. So these are all clients and participants that I've worked with in my life. And I won't say I did the best motivational interviewing, right? In all these examples, but you'd think with these really big and severe things happening in someone's life that they might be encouraged to make significant changes, right? Or to do something that feels more healthy, right? Or choose a better lifestyle or stop using substances, right? But we know that for many people, they don't, right? Um, the participant that I was working with that fell into the train tracks was still using substances, right? No interest in recovery or sobriety or abstinence at all, really. Our person who wants to be housed continues to break into their unit, even though they've been threatened with eviction already by their landlord. Our friend who has a really gnarly wound already has an amputation, right? Has experienced that. And our person who really wants to be housed won't sign that paperwork. I'm curious if anybody wants to fire off in the chat about what you think might be missing for these participants. Why don't they make that change or do the thing to prevent further harm or an eviction um, or a potential overdose? Why don't folks make that change? Thanks, Ryan. Good guess from John here in the chat, right? Motivation might be the missing ingredient or one of the missing ingredients, right? To why a client might not be able to move toward change and might be kind of maintaining their current situation or the status quo is language that you'll hear us use today. That some of our clients actually might not be feeling pretty motivated or have accessibility to motivation, right? Which is where we might come in as providers with the relationships that we have with folks, right? But we love to bring ourselves a little bit closer to our participants, right? I think we know that about our training sessions so far. So to bring us a little bit closer to the lives of the folks that we work with, we're curious about what motivates you in your own life, maybe your professional career life as like a helping professional, or in your just in your life in your personal life, right? What motivates you to get things done or to make an important change in your life? Family. Oh, a couple people to my family immediately, the first examples, right? So people you love and that love you back, right, might be pretty good motivation for you. Motivation might exist in relationships. I think that's great to be picking up on. For Ryan, we hear some values here, right? Feeling like I'm contributing to larger projects or sense of accomplishment, right? Some pretty long-term goals might be motivating for some folks. Anybody else have any examples or anything they'd like to share about what makes you feel motivated? What gets you to move when you haven't moved in so long? Or what gets you up in the morning when you are really having a rough day? Frustration with how things currently are. Yeah, I think that's sounds pretty adjacent to Ryan's idea of just like wanting to contribute, right? And feeling like we can. Awesome. This is a good start, but something that we hope that you can be thinking about. And maybe this training is an introduction to you thinking about what motivates you in your own life. What strategies work and don't work to motivate you. And that might also be helpful in thinking about what works and doesn't work in motivating participants, right? Knowing that I'm trying to help people. This is another good feeling good about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think a lot about, and I think Khalil can relate to this. Folks that exercise in particular ways or follow specific like exercise plans. Sometimes the key motivator there is not like a larger sense of values, although maybe it is, right? I value being healthy, um, living a long time, but sometimes it's also just like seeing things progress little by little, right? Making um, skilling up. I think about gamers even. Like what motivates gamers is seeing themselves like level up and like acquire goods and acquire skills in the game. And I think the same is true for exercisers, right? Seeing my muscles grow or being able to lift heavy things or being able to run further. So it's not always about the big long-term end goal, but sometimes it's about seeing little things occur that gets us moving, right? Oh, I was able to lift a heavier thing yesterday than I ever have. I think I want to keep lifting heavier things because that felt good, right? So these little steps along the way are really motivating as well.
Yeah, I love that example that Ryan shares about lifting heavy things specifically. There's a really cool book about trauma-informed weightlifting called Lifting Heavy Things by Laura Kudari, if that sounds interesting to anybody. Alrighty, so we talked about what motivates us, and we're able to see and observe like a lack of motivation in our participants pretty clearly sometimes, right? I gave some examples, and I'm sure you all have your own examples of what that's looked like in your own work and with your own participants. But motivation is what keeps us moving, right? It's that thing that makes us do things that we don't want to do sometimes, or the thing we really want to do sometimes, right? It's not a motivation doesn't always come when we're feeling low or bad. Like this can be like a both and sort of thing. We're feeling motivated. We can feel motivated to do things we really want to do, and also be motivated to do things that are more challenging as well. Um, Motivation also includes external and internal prompts to action, right? I might receive something if I go do this hard task, right? I'm benefiting in some way. But also, I think what we saw actually in the chat is these examples are a lot of kind of like internal things going on. Those are internal rewards, but an internal prompt might look like, I want to change something, or I'm frustrated with the way of the world right now, right? Might be that internal prompt for somebody to take action or to get up and go do your really difficult task or your difficult and heavy jobs and careers in maybe the helping space. Having clear goals um, can be motivating, right? When we know that our lives or what we're doing feels directional and we're going somewhere. I think certainty just feels good for most folks, right? And to be uncertain brings up some funky feelings. So having clear goals um, can be helpful for motivation. And maybe is motivation having something that just feels clear and accessible to us to work toward. Um, Motivation also happens between people. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but some folks in the chat have already said your family keeps you motivated, right? Makes you want to change some things, maybe makes you want to live longer. In my own life, I'd like to have children one day, and I don't, right? But as one of the ways I've been kind of reframing my own wellness journey, it was like, well, I want to live a long time so I can maybe have some children, right? And be in their lives for some time. Um, and that might be a motivator for me. But I think it speaks to motivation happening between people. If you've ever been engaged in any sort of like group therapy or peer support or anything like that, I think there's a lot of motivation that can be seen and observed in those spaces as well, of people really coming together to really lift folks up, cheer people on, encourage them to keep going in a very actionable way, right? It's like, no, you can do this, you've got this, you're working so hard, right? It's something we might see in group therapy or peer support settings. Um, Motivation is also something that can and should be evoked, right? We might be able to pull this out of somebody, right? In the helping profession, we've talked about in trauma from care training how sometimes we have this attitude or develop this attitude over the time where we feel like, ugh, I can't help anybody who doesn't want to help themselves, right? But if they are engaging with your agency and your services, they want and need something, right? And sometimes this takes a little bit of um, evocation. Is that a word? Sounds like one, right? Okay. And I think that aligns really closely to the idea of no one is unmotivated. And sometimes we do when our own frustrations make it into our workplace. We go, "Ah, this client just isn't motivated, so they're not going to get better. They're not going to be housed. They're not going to be sober," whatever that sounds like for you and your own agency and your own work context, right? But we believe that people are motivated, right? They might not have the same motivations as us, or they might not prioritize the things that we want them to be really motivated to do, but there might be something there, right? And those we hope can be opportunities to like tack on to and flush out a little bit for folks and cheer them on in the ways that they want to be.
I wanted to add on just two things that I was thinking about as you were speaking there, Khalil. The external and internal prompts to action. I think this is very visible to us as providers, or thinking about that case example that Khalil gave around a person who has a gnarly wound. That person probably has a bunch of people around them who are saying, you got to go to the doctor. You got to get this taken care of, right? Those would be external prompts to action, external motivators. And I think sometimes the folks that we serve who um, have been at the bottom end of a power dynamic for a long time in their lives, right? They're reliant on programs to support them with housing or maybe SSI or various things. I think they get a lot of external prompting, and many people are not paying attention to their own internal prompting, right? Talking about those values that we identified in the chat. I think the folks we serve don't always get a chance to um, think about those internal prompts to action, or like have relational conversations about those internal prompts. It's just you need to, you need to, you need to, right? And so while I do think external prompts to action are important motivators, if it's imbalanced, I think it's going to cause some defenses to come up for people. And then the other thing is I'm thinking about is having clear goals. Maybe you've sat in a room with somebody and you're having a goal conversation, and they say something like, "I just want to be healthy," or like, "I just want to be happy," right? We all probably want that, but it's not very motivating because it's not clear, right? So, okay, you want to be happy. What do you want to do? I don't know. I don't know what to do. Well, of course you don't know what to do, right? Like you haven't defined what happiness looks like yet, or you haven't said it out loud at least, right? And so I think the process of engaging in something like SMART goal generation can be actually a quite motivating component of a goal conversation with folks, because it just clarifies and narrows the focus of what being happy looks like or being healthy looks like, as opposed to feeling like so far away from this goal of happiness. I don't even know what that looks like or how to get there, right? So that's just what came up for me as you were talking, Khalil. Um, okay, want to talk a little bit about some basic assumptions of motivational interviewing, like what actually is motivational interviewing, where did it come from, and why we think it's helpful when we think about some of those cases that we've talked about already today. Right? So I'll start with just a brief history of motivational interviewing. It really came out of the 70s when a clinical psychologist named William Miller was practicing or was becoming educated. And he was a behaviorist, right? Everything at that time in the 70s was like consequences, behaviors, positive reinforcement. This was like the kind of lens that most people had at that time in terms of change. Well, it so happened that he also received some training from a person with a direct lineage to Carl Rogers. And if we're not familiar with Carl Rogers, that was a man who invented client-centered therapy, right? Like extremely human-centered, extremely person-centered, and very non-directive, right? Carl Rogers said that if you just get people talking and you do a lot of reflection and tuning into what they're talking about, often the things that would spur them to change will come out automatically. So let's just follow what people have to say, right? That person-centered attunement. So William Miller got some of this training from a person, I guess you'd call it like a grandkid of Carl Rogers, not literally, not flesh and blood, but a person twice removed from training directly with Carl Rogers, right? So that was happening in the 70s. And then in the 80s, in 1982, William Miller went to Norway and was doing some demonstration work with some psychologists and practitioners there. And they kept stopping him and say, "Why did you say that? Wait a minute. Why did you go in that direction?" They were so curious about the choices that William was making that they asked him, they kept interrupting and asking him, like, why are you doing this? And so he thought about it a little bit more closely and decided to write an informal paper, which he entitled Motivational Interviewing. And it was specifically around how to support people with alcohol use disorder, right? How do you support these people, and what do you say to them, and how do you influence their motivation? So it started in 1982. In the late 80s and early 90s, he met a man named Stephen Rolnick, and they partnered together to kind of flesh this out a little bit. Rolnick had heard about motivational interviewing, and he said, it was a great paper, but like, can you say more? There's like so much more to understand here. I don't even know if I'm doing it right. And so they developed this process, these procedures, this way of being, starting in the early 90s. And wrote that first book. It came out in 1991, the first edition of Motivational Interviewing. So it's been around a long time, right? Over 30 years now that motivational interviewing has been in our lexicon, has been a part of many practitioners' training. By the year 2021, over 2,000 controlled clinical trials have been conducted on motivational interviewing across a wide range of disciplines, right? People from things that do not relate to supportive housing at all have been attempting to use motivational interviewing to spur people towards change for quite a long time. Some of those applications include education, in the education spaces, in the life and health coaching spaces, in sports, in organizational leadership, in probation and parole, and many, many, many more. These days, you'll find that motivational interviewing is actually being taught and practiced across the world in a number of different languages, and including a cultural responsiveness component to it. And so that's really the point of what I wanted to say to you here at the end of this slide, is that motivational interviewing is highly adaptable and can be culturally responsive, right? I do think we think of it, or at least I have tended to think of it, as something that you do in these like therapy spaces, right? It's one-on-one therapy, and I'm trying to support a person who's probably paying with insurance and yada yada yada, right? It's broader than that. It has broader application than that. It's been quite well studied, actually. So that's our brief history of motivational interviewing. And so, what is it? What actually is motivational interviewing? I think this quote is both very vague and also so correct about what it is. Miller and Rolnick say that motivational interviewing is simply a way of being, a way of talking with people about change and growth to strengthen their own motivation. It's a way of being with people. And I emphasize that bullet point there and kind of restate it because motivational interviewing can really be um, used in parallel with whatever other tools we're using, right? If you're using CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing can run in parallel with it. If you're practicing housing first or harm reduction ways of being with people, motivational interviewing fits. It's not its own treatment regimen, it's a way of being with people. How do we show up to the therapeutic relationship, to the helper relationship? It's also something that's quite directional and intentional, right? It is moving towards something. Which makes it a little bit different than client-centered therapy that Carl Rogers talked about, that Rogerian way of being, where you kind of just like hold people. You make space, you hold it, and then people are going to move in whatever directions they want, and we tend to follow. Here with motivational interviewing, we're actually kind of making strategic movement toward goals, right? And we're intending to move people in a direction. But it's not a way of getting people to do what we want them to do, which I think is a great challenge for us in our supportive housing spaces, right? Our programs are designed certain ways. They're designed to house people. They're designed to help them keep them healthy, to see long-term outcomes in terms of housing stability and long-term health, to see them maybe reduce their substance use. Our programs have so many kind of reasons for being. And yet, if all we're focused on is what we want folks to do, I don't think we're actually doing motivational interviewing, right? And then it's also just not just being nice to people, which I think some people think, right? You've been through a couple motivational interviewing trainings, and it's like, oh, I know how to be nice. I know how to be responsive to what people say, and that's not enough, right? There is more to motivational interviewing in terms of strategic progress toward goals. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say as a kind of large overview of motivational interviewing. And then I'm going to kick it back to Khalil, who's going to talk to us about the spirit of motivational interviewing and its components.
Awesome. So PACE is an acronym that we might use to understand the spirit of motivational interviewing and what really underlies the tools and then recommendations made for what it looks like to do motivational interviewing, right? So the P in PACE stands for partnership, right? So this really refers to an active collaboration between you and the client, right? If you think back to our trauma-informed care training, collaboration is one of the 6 key principles, right? And it sounds a lot like partnership, right? A client is just always going to be more willing to express concerns with you and share about their behaviors and what they're doing when you are empathetic and show genuine curiosity about their experience and their perspective in their own situation and what's going on in their life. Um, and as a helper, you do have influence, right, in that relationship in the same way that any of your relationships exist that with influence, right? I have a friend who is asking for some accountability around some like health things, and sometimes he calls me when he's sitting in the Popeyes parking lot, right? He says, "Hey, I really don't want to do this right now," and I'm like, "Oh," and that's not natural for me to be like, "No, leave," right? But this was a collaborative process. This is a friend who I love very much and has contributed a lot to my life. So, um, but that came from like me being able to like talk to him in that way came from some collaboration and rapport building, right? And that was something that we decided together that he wanted to do for his own healthy accountability. Um, Partnership might also include recognizing our own expertise, right? But also the expertise of the person that we're working with, right? We come with some stuff. We have some knowledge. We studied whatever. We've worked however long, sure, right? That matters. So we might have some stuff. We might have some gems that could really contribute to somebody's life, but also making sure that we also hold the understanding that the people that we work with are like the undisputed experts, right? You can dispute our knowledge and what we know or what we think we know, right? But when it comes to lived experience and how people feel, that is something that is a little more difficult, and I'd say probably like unethical to be disputing, right? Um, so then the A in PACE stands for acceptance, right? People walk into our doors, house or not, with worth, right? They're not worth any more, any less because of the resources that they have or because of their housing status. And I think a lot of folks probably in this webinar believe that, right? That housing is a human right. Um, and this doesn't mean that we agree with everything that a participant says all the times, whether they might behave or act or like specific substance use behaviors, right? But it does mean we're not going to chase them away because of that, right? And sometimes we're not chasing people away intentionally. Sometimes we do that unintentionally. I think oftentimes it's probably unintentional, right? Um, Ryan gave the example of a client with a wound on their arm, right? And we talked about that a little bit as like a potential like motivational issue. Sometimes people aren't going to receive wound care. Well, if every time you see this participant that has this really gross wound and it's open and festering, maybe looks infected is what I meant to say. um I'm glad I caught myself there. If it looks infected and you're telling them, wow, this looks dangerous, you need to go to the hospital. And if that is always our tone and what we are communicating there, um, the likelihood that they're going to go do that is very unlikely, right? And they might actually start to avoid us, which really limits our opportunity to support them in getting any wound care at all at any point if they start avoiding us because we're like, why aren't you taking care of yourself? Go get this checked out, right? Um, so again, that doesn't mean we are accepting that they keep injecting in the spot or like are prolonging like the development of this wound. But we are accepting that something about going to get medical care right now is difficult. And there might be some work we can do there. The C in PACE stands for compassion. I think this is a word that we use a lot, right? Like, oh, I'm compassionate, or oh, this person is very compassionate. But what this means is or what this is going to refer to is our active promotion of the client's welfare and prioritizing the client's needs, right? I'd even take this a little further and say this is like a client's communicated needs. I think a lot of time that frustration of like not feeling like we can help somebody is because we're probably not listening to what they're communicating their needs are, right? Compassion is a feeling We feel it. We can feel compassionate for somebody. And we might do that by really prioritizing what they're sharing, right? And this links back to like that partnership and collaboration piece there. And then the last E is empowerment. And we also heard this in the trauma-informed care. Is that true? Probably. We say empowerment a lot. But empowerment is going to be moving away from the deficit model, right? Of like something is wrong with you. I have what you need. You need to do X, Y, and Z to get it, right? When we want to be empowering a client, we are emphasizing and bringing out and naming the strengths that we already know that they have and that maybe we've seen. And when clients are pretty low, this is kind of hard to do, right? I've walked into homes that are in pretty rough shape, and clients are might not be very healthy as a result of like maybe like some chronic illness, substance use stuff going on. And that's a hard moment to be like, okay, what can you do? What are you good at right now with current capabilities and functioning, right? But is something that I think we are certainly capable of doing. And folks need to be reminded of a lot. I like to think about the idea of, I don't believe nobody like wants help or wants support, but I do think because of how stigmatizing some of the behaviors and like situations that our folks are in, that they believe that they're not worth that support or worth that help. So when it's offered to them, they're like, no, that's not for me, right? And I think empowerment is turning that on its head. Is like, actually, you can take a shower, right? Not in that language, right? But like, actually, like you do deserve medical care, and to be affirmed in the ways that make you feel good. So that's PACE. And we like to say that this acronym really revolves around, or really speaks to the spirit of motivational interviewing, right? So again, that's partnership, acceptance, compassion, and empowerment. So another really important thing to be keeping in mind in motivational interviewing and really in just being a competent helping professional is to also be and remain as person-centered as possible, right? And this looks like taking a very exploratory approach sometimes, which means like engage in your curiosity. We want to fix, we want to help, and we have a lot of knowledge, right? But that might do something to the relationship and our ability to actually hear and receive a client situation sometimes, right? So engaging with all of our participants, like it is for the first time, might be something that helps us engage in that curiosity a little more, right? Sure, we've worked with hundreds of folks experiencing homelessness before, right? But all of them have very different journeys to homelessness, different traumas, right? We've talked about our ACEs in the Trauma from Care series, right? Everyone has a very different journey to homelessness and also a very different experience of what it's like to be living or experiencing street homelessness specifically. So we don't want to assume that we already know what's happening and what might be needed. I do think our work experience is certainly helpful in like, okay, I've navigated this thing with a participant before in this way and it worked, right? Which might be a good starting point, but we should also be open to feedback of when that's not going to work for a participant. Because we know that I would argue that our jobs are so creative and require a lot of troubleshooting and pivoting to make things really work for folks. Being person-centered means paying close attention, right? A client might not need what we have in the moment, but still might be communicating needs, right? And that is important as well, because even if I can't provide it, maybe Ryan can, or Laura can, or somebody I know can, right? Or some other agency might be able to help the participant with their communicated needs. Being in the moment, being present is going to be super important. And I know this sounds so surface level, but folks know when you're not listening to them, right? One of my friends has a personal trainer who sometimes is like on their phone. That's just not very present, right? You want to know that the person you're engaging with is present with you and really listening and hearing what you're saying. And again, I think this can be applied to our own lives, right? If you're having a conversation with somebody and their face is in their phone, right? What does that feel like? being person-centered means also being able to regulate our emotions and presenting in a way that uh, is perceived as calm. I'd say maybe even confident, right? We don't want to be so impacted by something somebody is sharing that they feel like they can't tell us, right? We talked about the solid object in the Trauma Informed Care series, right? Participants need to know that they can come to you and share what's going on in their lives. So that's going to be important as well. And considering ourselves a guest. I think this is so important, especially in the housing world too, when we're walking into somebody's home, right? I in the housing first space, there are sometimes folks in the roles who get really comfortable and like maybe not knocking on doors, which is very like far away from the idea of being trauma informed, right? So I think about this quite literally, right? You are a guest in somebody's home. And if we don't work in the housing space, we're just a guest in somebody's world, right? We're letting them talk to us. Home might be their camp or sleeping space. And this sounds probably agency or job specific, right? It doesn't have to be an actual home. You don't have to exist in like the housing first world to respect somebody's shelter space or their bed or their little corner as their space, right? And perceiving ourselves as guests there. So that looks like asking for consent, permission in these spaces as well, in how you move um, and navigate physical space. But also this applies to like experiences too, right? So physical space, but also we want to be open to the things that folks are sharing with us from their perspective. I talked about trauma-informed care a lot, so I'm probably going to breeze through the next slide a little more quickly. So some of the similarities and highlights or like links to trauma-informed care include embracing the process of connection and also knowing that connection is a process, right? We are helpers, helping professionals, and sometimes we just assume somebody's going to trust us because of our role or our position, right? But that's a process. Again, think about the people in your own lives, right? In your personal lives. We're not just trusting right away. If we are, that might be a mental health symptom, and we should challenge that a little bit, right? But we really, that takes time, and there might be some good data we're collecting as we're getting to know folks. Relationships are important, and they're probably going to be important to any change we make or want to make or hope to make with and alongside a participant. And also, there's no expected ending with participant behavior, right? We're not going to get to like one endpoint and then just be done with any sort of goal setting or future planning at all, right? Anything to add here about endings, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of understanding that like people's goals are evolving. And I think sometimes we think along with that like expert mentality that we sometimes bring to the table, we're saying you have a problem and I'm going to fix it and then the end, right? It's more um, you're moving in a direction and we want to help you get there. So thinking about directionality and spectrums more than like completions, I think is always valuable. And it reminds me, Kala, we talk a little bit about this in kind of culturally responsive services type trainings where cultural humility is this ongoing reflective process as opposed to achieving a level of cultural competence. And I think it's a similar concept here, right? Goal work, change work is evolving. My values are different today than they were 1 year ago and 5 years ago and 10 years ago, right? And so there's this journey that we're alongside people through.
Thanks for adding that, Ryan. And then the last link here is that idea of I'm here to accompany you, right? This is much different than like I'm here to save you, um, or I'm here to fix this for you, right? Our work needs to be as collaborative as possible. And I say this a lot in the harm reduction trainings, but I do think a collaborative process means like we all win, right? Because clients are not feeling coerced. You are not feeling guilt or shame into making clients do things that they don't want to do, and you don't have like that guilt or shame of potentially re-traumatizing folks. And you could feel good about still pushing clients toward their own self-identified goals here, right? So we're here to accompany, not necessarily save. And I think the link with motivational interviewing here is that if we're not saving somebody, there are some natural consequences there, right? That folks are going to experience after they experience an eviction or an additional overdose or another medical emergency or an amputation, right? Our folks know and are experiencing some pretty intense natural consequences.
Yeah, I also like the word accompany here, and I just want to go back one slide actually, to kind of highlight this graphic at the bottom. And I think accompany fits with this graphic as well, where motivational interviewing tries to place itself in the guiding role. We're not just following wherever people want to go, right? There we have jobs that are meant to like support people. These supportive housing spaces are meant to solve some problems for people, right? And if we just followed every single choice that someone made, I don't know that we could say that we were effectively doing our work, right? It is sometimes the choices that people are making that led them to need our support in the first place. But it's also not directing them and telling them what to do, right? Which is never going to go well. People do not like to be told what to do, how to do, maybe sometimes for a little while. But when you think about supportive housing spaces where, I think about the Housing First agency that Khalil and I worked at, sometimes folks live there for the rest of their lives, right? And sometimes it's um, a couple decades long that folks are living in supportive housing, right? And so how long are you going to direct their life, right? How long are you going to micromanage somebody's life for? It doesn't make sense to me. So motivational interviewing, sort of that accompanying role, is guiding. We're a guide on a journey, and we'll hear William Miller in a short video talk a little bit about this process of guiding. But I think that aspect of accompanying highlights it well. Okay, I want to ask this question around whose goals are we talking about? And I'm asking this question of myself a little bit, right? Because Khalil and I talk so much about autonomy in helper spaces, right? Especially it comes up in harm reduction, it comes up in housing first, and it comes up in trauma informed care, where people should have the ability to make their own choices and direct their own lives. I believe that quite firmly. It is one of my most highly held values, like personally. And yet we talked about the way that motivational interviewing, it does try and like direct people towards goals, right? It does try and get people to change. And so the question I am wrestling with sometimes with motivational interviewing is motivational interviewing actually aligned with autonomy, right? Aligned with people self-determining their own lives. And this comes up quite a bit in harm reduction, right? One of the things that I've often said in harm reduction trainings is harm reduction is not necessarily a gentle on-ramp to recovery, right? Where if we do harm reduction, we then expect somebody will enter recovery maybe just at a later date, right? That might be nice, but that might not be that person's goal, right? They may never be interested in like an abstinence-based recovery. And so how does this square? If we're trying to get people to move, how does that square with harm reduction? How does it square with housing first and giving people the right to self-determine their own lives? And I think it does square quite a bit. I want to give you a quick example that comes from the fourth edition of the motivational interviewing text, where the example is attempting to use motivational interviewing in a like refugee um, context, right? So it's been tried in a Danish departure center to use motivational interviewing when people were denied asylum to get them to move on of their own volition, right? So they were denied asylum, they're living in these refugee camps, and the government was trying to motivate them to leave the country so they didn't have to deal with them anymore, right? In this case, that's not an appropriate use of motivational interviewing. That is a coercive use of motivational interviewing because what they were doing was they were requiring mandatory motivational interviewing sessions every month with these folks. They're saying, we're going to get you to move and you must come to this session in which I'm going to get you to make that decision. What makes it inappropriate is that the power differential that exists there is being used to prompt action that is not in that person's best interest. There's a reason they left their country of origin. There's a reason they arrived at that border, and they believe it is in their best interest to be there. And we're trying to convince people to move in a different direction from their own best interest, right? Or something that they're not interested in doing. The problem with this, of course, is the coercive nature of it. And it's also that it's not possible. There is not evidence that shows that we can cause people to move in directions against their own motivations and values. It's just not going to work, right? And so, of course, what happened in that example in the book is that it didn't work. They didn't get people to move on of their own volition at any significant rate, and it was just frustrating for the cops and frustrating for the refugees, right? It just created frustration and conflict. It didn't create motivation for change. And so when I think about autonomy and supporting people's autonomy and using motivational interviewing, I think what we're really doing is trying to find some Venn diagrams between what we want for people and what they want for themselves. You tell me you want all of these things for yourself, and that's a big circle of stuff. I want all of these things for you, and that's a big circle of stuff. Somewhere in there, there's an overlap, right? Somewhere in there, your goals align with what I want for you. And when it's your goal, I'm going to be able to influence your motivation positively for you to make a change to your own goal, right? So motivational interviewing involves mobilizing a person's own motivations, not installing new ones. If a person doesn't care about a thing, I'm not there to make them care about that thing. I'm there to draw out from them what do they care about and how can we use that to move them in a direction that is both healthy and something that they want. It's also been said that that a goal is not a goal in this context unless it's a shared goal. We both have to agree on the work, right? And so that's a critical component of motivational interviewing. We've been talking for a little while, close to an hour now, 50 minutes or so. And I just want to pause really quickly here, invite some questions or comments if you have any. If not, that's okay. We'll keep moving, but I just want to make space for how any of this might be sitting with you, if you're feeling alignment in your work settings, if this is making sense, or if it's not making sense. So I'll just pause there, let people chat or use the Q&A box, and I will take a sip of water. Yeah, I see Laura puts a critical question here in the chat, and it's how do we deal with how do we avoid power struggles? Because that's what I'm asking you to do right here, right? I'm saying use motivational interviewing to get people to move in the direction that they want to do. And yet sometimes that is going to be in conflict with our program goals, right? The thing you're doing is going to get you evicted from your apartment. My whole purpose in your life is to help you stay housed. There's a power struggle that exists there. And guess what? Me as a provider, I hold more power in that circumstance. I can threaten you, right? I can say, if you don't, you're going to be evicted and then you're going to be on the bottom of the list. I can show up every day and harass you, knocking on your doors. I can make your life miserable, right? Because I hold a great deal of power in that relationship. Without getting too in the weeds on this question, it's a great question. And I think we've got some content a little later in the training that's going to speak to this. We want to sidestep power struggles, right? We don't want to engage with them at all. If we find ourselves convincing, persuading, getting people to do something different from what they're already doing that we want them to do, we're doing the wrong thing, right? And so I think my short answer here is stop. Just pause. If you find yourself butting heads with a client about a decision or a change, just pause. We'll offer some more tools to use like once you've made that pause. But I think the crucial component here is that not everybody recognizes that when they're in power struggles with people, right? We get into this place where we're persuading, and then we've been talking for 20 minutes and I realize, oh my God, why am I doing this? Like, this doesn't even make sense. I'm in conflict right now with my client, right? And so I think the key strategy that I want to share right now is just pause and notice. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Khalil?
Yeah, I think also I'm curious about what part feels like the struggle, because that I actually think like might be like the work is the struggle that the client isn't. Am I frustrated that the client's not making progress, right? Am I frustrated that I can't help my participant is something that might come up here. But I also think about this in a nuanced way. And when Ryan says just stop, I think that is a lot of like there's a lot of like proactivity needed there to recognize when we are feeling more activated by a participant. And I think about actually the idea of natural consequences. Sometimes our participants can be pretty escalated, right? And if a client is cussing me out, a natural consequence is going to be I don't want to talk to them anymore, right? And that is a natural consequence that exists in relationship. Now, in my working role, I might need to follow up with this person and engage in some sort of like healthy or intentional repair at some point, right? But I think that's a very normal thing to do to be able to stop, take space, and could be somewhat of a modeling behavior. That's what I think as a very like direct answer to the like how do we avoid power struggles is we maybe don't have them um, if we can. And I also think that that comes from a good place. We get so frustrated that our participants aren't making decisions that are like that we feel are toward health or like that we know might improve their life or make them happier or healthier, you know. So that is a naturally frustrating experience, and the goal isn't to avoid it. The goal is to not take that frustration out on our participants. um yeah, but I think a very natural thing to be doing, and it's probably why we all landed in this space, because we do care about those things. Sorry, I saw you unmuted, Laura. If you had anything you want to share there, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that I have fallen into that trap many, many times over the years. And I think I've gotten better about catching myself in my later years because I just don't have the energy for power struggles anymore. um, but it, there's so many opportunities to get into power struggles. You know, when our funding source says that they want us to accomplish this goal with our clients, and so that's what's in the assessment and the case management plan. You know, it's real easy to get into a power struggle there because we've got people holding our purse strings um, with expectations. It's also easy to get into power struggles with our clients in their personal relationships. And that's probably one that has tripped me up a lot is that if I have a client who's in a domestic violence relationship or they have a friend that they've gone through they've aged out of foster care with, and they've gone through the shelter system with that friend, and that friend is a very negative influence and they make bad decisions when they're with that friend. I've learned that if I get into a power struggle that involves this third party, um, I'm going to lose every time. And I may lose the relationship with that client and not be able to help them with anything because it became more about me trying to convince them that something was wrong and talk them into what I thought was best rather than accompanying them on their journey.
Yeah, that's such a relatable example, Laura, and I appreciate you just like being brave enough to say that you have fallen into that trap. So say we all, actually, whether we want to admit it or not, right? I think those traps are all around, and I think you're right that some of what you're speaking to is like the depth of relationship is going to be less than that person who they grew up with or whatever, right? There's no way that the relationship I've built in the last 3 weeks is going to um, allow me to have heavier persuasive power than that other person, or even if it's not a third person, it's a set of reasons that we're fighting against, right? And I don't want to be fighting with somebody's reasons for how they are. I want to understand them, and I want to use those reasons to help them move towards a goal that we can both agree with, which might not be the thing that the purse string says. Here's what I want to say about purse strings. Purse strings are not person centered. And yet they're the reality, right? That is the reality of how this work occurs. But I think it's always helpful. It's always been helpful for me as a provider to sort of step back, and when I find myself in conflict with program goals or like funder goals, I'm like, I know I'm doing the right thing because I'm being person centered, and that money is not, right. That money is about helping people, but it's about helping people in an almost warehouse sort of way. We've got this big pot of money and everybody's got to do it this way. Well, that's not individualized, right? That's not person-centered. And so I have to find a spot where the goals do overlap. So I'm not fighting that battle.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
see that a lot, and we'll continue to see that a lot in this like continuing conversation about DEI and what happens with DEI, right? Big institutions are like at risk of like losing funding if they don't change or adjust language. RAIN, RAINN might be one that folks have um, heard about recently, right? They've like excluded some folks that they've historically supported in the past because of what's coming down the line federally, right? And I think that's a really real life and big example of purse strings. It's like some folks are making decisions based on continuing to provide services, but maybe navigating those individual relationships in ways that still feel affirming and supportive.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move us along here. Uh, so what do I want to say here? We've kind of touched on the broad stroke principles of what motivational interviewing is. And we're going to start to get into like, how do we do the work as an individual? Like what should be happening inside our heads and understanding what's actually happening for the person across from us when they're struggling to make a change, right? And that change can be many and varied. That can be deciding to go get my wounds taken care of. That can be deciding not to break my windows in so I get into my house when I lose my keys. Um, that can be deciding that maybe using substances near the train tracks is not in my best interests, right? It's so many changes are possible. And that's where I think the kind of harm reduction conversation comes in. Am I trying to get this person to be off drugs? Maybe if that's what they want, but maybe not. Maybe what I'm trying to get them to do is move in the direction of a shared goal of not overdosing. That doesn't look like abstinence necessarily, right? And yet there's work that we can do towards a shared goal. So I want to kind of present this concept of ambivalence. It's a crucial concept in motivational interviewing. And to define it simply, it's when a person both wants to and does not want to make a change. And here I want to say that like this is the most human thing that we're going to say in this slide deck, right? Because I think all of us sit in places of ambivalence for things all the time. Um, do I want to go to the grocery store for the fifth time this week? Or do I want to just say to the family, eat whatever is in the cabinet? I'm not going again. That's a silly example. There's so many changes in our lives where there's reasons why I want to do a thing, but there's a bunch of reasons why I don't want to do a thing. And that is the case with every single one of our clients, right? That person who needs to get some wound care, I bet there are very good reasons why they're not doing it. I bet they've been treated poorly in the past by providers. I bet they're scared about getting the news that they're going to be amputated again. But I bet they know that it's probably in their best interest to do it. So they're sitting in this middle place. They're weighing the pros and cons. Khalil says he wants to go to the gym, but he also really doesn't want to go to the gym. Yeah, that's real. I want to eat healthier, but I really love Doritos. That's the one. That's my example that I often give. So some things that kind of come up related to ambivalence is the familiarity of where we're at currently, right? So that person who is being offered an apartment, but they're refusing to sign the paperwork to come inside. There is a familiarity to how they've been living, right? Maybe I've been on the street for 2 years. I know everybody around me. I know how I'm going to eat every single day. Is it comfortable? No. Am I my happiest? No. But that familiarity makes risk hard. It makes hard to make changes and grow in certain ways. So the familiarity of the status quo is an important component of ambivalence. And then the kind of factors that I'm going to say here about change can go either way too. Is this change that I want to make important? Well, yeah, there's reasons it's important and reasons it's not. Is it necessary? Yeah, reasons for and against. Is it advantageous to make this change? Again, for and against. And then is it even possible? And I do think people get stuck in the possible a lot, right? They jump ahead. They say, "Yeah, I want to do that thing, but I can't do it." I don't even think it's possible for me to do it given my current circumstances, right? And so there's a lot to play with in terms of change for people. Most importantly, ambivalence is a very normal part of the change process. I bet there's very few changes that you've made in your own life that didn't involve yeses and nos, right? The last time you got a new job, I bet there were good reasons to stay at your old job, and there are good reasons to move on. It's very human and very normal. And I keep saying that over and over again because every single change our clients are making, they're sitting in this place of ambivalence. And owning that, honoring that is a part of our steps into motivational interviewing. So I'm kicking it over to Khalil to talk about sustained talk and change talk.
Oh, sorry, I was unmuted. I also just realized, Laura, your examples in the chat earlier were only going to the hosts and panelists chat instead of to everybody. I just made that error myself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I was like, wait a minute, who am I talking to? Um, this I think is a pretty significant takeaway from like the chunk of time that we have today. It's this idea of sustained talk and change talk. Its relationship to it, ambivalence is like or is these are going to be the things that push us. If you imagine ambivalence existing right there at that like leveled scale, right? I know why I want to do this and also why I don't want to do this. So I'm just going to do nothing, or I'm not going to make any movement or take any action, is the idea of maintaining the status quo, right? It's not always bad. It is just maintaining, right? Maybe continuing to do the same thing that we have, right? Our participants who are not going to go get wound care, our participants who are not going to sign that documentation, our participants who have been hit by trains, right? And still don't change any behaviors, right? That is what ambivalence is. And again, is very normal. But I also want to paint the picture of ambivalence as somewhat of an opportunity, right? If you've ever heard anything about the stages of change, right? Pretty buzzworthy in our field. But I'd argue that people who are feeling or experiencing ambivalence are probably in the contemplation stage, right? They are thinking about making a change, right? It's great if a participant comes to us with some ambivalence, right? Because if we can, we're going to have an exercise where we are identifying more specifically around what sustained talk and change talk sounds like and looks like. But if we're able to kind of capitalize on that change talk and really understand and dig through and identify the strengths that somebody might be naming out loud, that's going to be what's leading them toward the change that they want to make in their lives, right? Or the change that the agency and the participant has agreed that they want to be making in their lives. I also really appreciate this scale or this like double-sided arrow on the bottom of status quo and change, because I think this is a great substitute or a great reframe from labeling things as good versus bad, right? Is this decision making me or moving our participant toward change, the change they want in their lives, or is it moving them away from that change and encouraging them to maintain that status quo, right? And implementing language like this just provides more opportunity. If something is bad, there's just so much permanence and finality in that language, right? My client made a bad decision. That's not giving them the opportunity to make any changes or adjustments in their lives or to move toward change, growth, healing, whatever that goal is, right? But if we can acknowledge that our participants are maintaining, sustaining like current behaviors, right, that aren't moving them towards change, that's a signal that we can get creative, right? And we might be able to implement some problem-solving strategies to support them in moving toward change. So the next slide is what we hope the outcome of our like motivational interviewing interventions might do for folks, right? We want to hang on and really pull out that change talk and the growth and good positive things, maybe the strengths that our participants are sharing or that we can identify in what our participants are sharing, and really cheer them on, hang on to them, amplify them, make them bigger, right? So that this change part of the scale is outweighing that sustained talk, right? So if someone was in the contemplation stage before, they're now able to take action, right? Or maybe feeling a little more motivated to take action than they were before. Also, change talk should revolve around participant goals, participant strengths, and maybe even their specific verbiage, right? We don't just want to be throwing things out that sound really motivational and good and aspiring, right? Um, because that risks not being participant centered, right? This sounds good, so I'm going to say it. Change talk may actually be more accessible and easy for a participant when it's been their own words, right? That's language that they have, language that they've been using. And if we are just arguing kind of in a way that we may perceive to be healthy or toward growth or healing, we might actually like increase the chances that they're going to engage in more sustained talk, right? Then it becomes more of a battle, right? Well, why don't you do X, Y, and Z because that seems like the best decision. A participant will have a million reasons why they don't want to do something, right? And be able to tell you as a result of that, right? Which increases the sustained talk. Um, or I'm sorry, it makes it heavier. So I guess the scale would go down, not up. But yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add one other piece here, which is that when we were talking earlier about the way that motivational interviewing is semi-directive, this is what we mean. We are intending to tip the scales towards change, right? We're not just trying to let people kind of wallow in whatever status quo they're in. And so we're putting our finger on the scale, but we're also not trying to engage in a power struggle with that, right? And so the way we do that is not by installing change talk in people, it's by amplifying the change talk that they're already stating, right? I have reasons why I probably should make this change. Oh, let me hear that, right? Like let's talk about those things as opposed to me giving them reasons for change, right? Okay, want to give you another acronym here. Our first acronym was PACE in the spirit of motivational interviewing. Our second acronym is DARN CAT, and today we're going to focus just on the darn part of that darn cat. So when people are talking about a potential change, um, change talk are any of those statements that are made that are going to point towards a willingness to change, right? And so, how do we know when we're hearing change talk versus when we're hearing status quo or sustained talk? Some easy examples are when people talk about their desire to change, right? I want to be able to make this change so that I can be around for my kids. I want to do this so that I don't lose another limb. I want to do this because I love this apartment and I don't want to be evicted, right? So when we hear words like want, wish, like, or love, we're hearing people express desire, right? And desire is a critical component of change talk, right? So what I'm asking you to do is be attuned to some of these words, right? When we're attuned to these words, it kind of can trigger us to say, oh, I'm hearing change talk. It's something I should probably reflect back. It's something I should sit with a little bit, right? It's something I should be with and amplify. Um, Other things that people might talk about is their ability to make change, right? Do I even think I can make change? Do I even think life is possible through the process of change, right? And so it's expressed in statements about people's self perception of their own capability. It's confidence statements, right? And so when we hear words like I can do that, or I could I could cut down on how much I'm injecting, maybe one less time a day or something like that, or I think I'm able to do X, Y, and Z. I think I'm able to remember to keep my keys with me, versus having to break in the house. It may be possible to do X, Y, and Z, right? So can, could, able, and possible speak to somebody's confidence in their ability. And that's change talk. The next one is the R is people's reasons for change. And often this is expressed as like arguments for change, right? And so you'll hear it in this like if then kind of component, right? It's like, well, if I do this, then I might benefit in this way, right? So they're giving you their reason for change. Well, if I stop having to break into my apartment, um, I'm not going to have the cops called on me every week, right? Or I'm trying to think of some of those earlier examples that Khalil gave. Um, the one that stuck in my head is the train example because it's like so dramatic. If I use further away from the train tracks, then maybe it'll lead to me feeling safer when I use, right? So if then language are when people are giving their own reasons for change. We want to be attuned to that. And then finally, people will talk about their need for change. And it's usually expressed in statements about importance or urgency. Sometimes people will even give you their need for change as a quote from something somebody else said. Well, my doctor says I have to do this, otherwise I'm going to have a heart attack. Well, my doctor says this needs to happen, otherwise I'm going to have another amputation, right? Or something like that. So have to, need to, must, and got to are expressions of need that people are talking about, right? So when people are giving their desire, their ability, their reasons, or their need, we're hearing change talk, in which case we can know that there's ambivalence present and the possibility to move towards change is also present, right? And so kind of the remainder of this series that we're in is going to be finding ways to amplify people's own motivations and own change talk so that they just do the thing and we don't have to force them at all, right? They've given their own reasons and they're ready. Give you a couple other quick examples of change talk and sustain talk. This is related to somebody who might be a problem drinker. We showed this graphic the last time we did a motivational interviewing group training with your group, but I just love it. It kind of talks about the way it can show up as both a change talk or a sustain talk, right? So somebody says here, I want to cut down on my drinking. Or they might say, I love how drinking makes me feel. Two different relationships to drink right there. They might have both of those feelings at the same time, right? That's that ambivalence. Somebody could say, I could cut back to one drink with dinner on the weekends. I think I could do that. Or I can manage my life just fine without giving up alcohol. Sustain talk versus change talk. Their reasons. I'll miss less time at work if I cut down on my drinking. Versus getting drunk helps me unwind. There's a reason for it, right? And then finally, the need, the N in the darn cat. The need might sound like, I have to cut down. My doctor told me that the amount I'm drinking puts my health at risk. Versus, I need to get drunk to deal with the day-to-day. Otherwise, I'm not going to make it, right? So listening very carefully to this change talk and sustain talk. I want to kind of take us through a quick activity now or an engagement exercise around identifying change talk and sustain talk, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this little kind of snapshot, this little client scenario out loud. And everywhere you see a box, I want to ask you to assess whether you think this is change talk or sustain talk that you're hearing, right? And so if you think you hear change talk, I'll ask you to put a plus sign in the chat, right? And people can do this all at once. If you think you hear sustain talk, I'd like you to put a minus, okay? So I'm going to read through it all the way through once, and then I'm going to read through it again, stopping at each one of these blanks, and allow folks to jump in and make their own assessment. Here we go. My daughter says that I should move to live with them now that I'm getting older. It's getting harder to live on my own. I'd enjoy being closer to our grandchildren, but it's also kind of exhausting when I'm there even for a few days. It sure would be a relief not to have to take care of this apartment. And they certainly could help me with the things I don't know how to do. But moving to a whole new city at my age would be hard. I don't even want to think about the downsizing it would take. And most of my friends live here. Still, who knows what will happen as I get older? And it would be nice to be close to family. Though, what if they decided to move somewhere else? Okay, so that's the scenario. And I'm going to kind of read it statement by statement now. And I'm going to ask you kind of statement by statement whether it's a change talk or a sustain talk. So use a plus or a minus. All right, here's the first statement that I'll reread. It's getting harder to live on my own. What are we hearing, folks? Change talk or sustain talk? Give me a plus or a minus in the chat there. Ooh, okay, I see Elaine marks it as a change talk. John is marking it as a sustain talk. Ooh, I love it. Learning moments here. Anybody else? Add your plus or a minus if it's a change talk or a sustain talk. Okay, I see another vote for plus, another vote for plus. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. All right. I'm going to go ahead and show the answer now. And I'm marking this as change talk, not sustained talk. And here's my rationale for this. This person is saying, it's getting harder to live on my own. The change is moving in with the daughter, right? And so I'm hearing a reason or maybe I would hear an ability comment. It's hard to live on my own. I don't know if I can do it anymore. To me, that's moving in the direction of change versus the status quo of living alone independently, right? All right, so +1 to the pluses. All right, here's my next statement. I'd enjoy being closer to our grandchildren. Plus or minus there. Is that sustained talk or change talk? Oh no, I think I'm getting them mixed up now. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, here we go. I see now. I'm seeing so far just pluses. Change talk. Any minuses? Any sustained talk, folks? I'd enjoy being closer to my children. Yeah, seeing a lot of pluses. And you're right. That is change talk moving in the direction of change versus staying still in the status quo. All right, here's the next one. But it's also kind of exhausting when I'm there, even for a few days. Change talk or sustain talk? It's exhausting when I'm there, even for a few days. Yeah, they're exactly right. This is a minus, folks. So this person is giving a reason why they don't want to make this move, which is the status quo. So that's a minus. Good work. Okay. It sure would be a relief not to have to take care of this apartment. Is that change talk or sustain talk? It sure would be a relief not to have to take care of this apartment. Seeing pluses so far. Pluses, pluses. Pluses, pluses, pluses. Can't you see? All right. That is a plus. That is change talk. Yeah, they're giving kind of maybe an ability, maybe a desire statement, I guess you could say. I think it's an ability one, right? So yeah, that's a plus. That's change talk. All right, here's the next one. Wait, I'm getting confused. Certainly would be a relief. Yeah, that's change talk. Okay, here's my next one. They certainly could help me with the things I don't know how to do. Is that a reason for change or is that a status quo? Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing all pluses. Yeah, you got it. Okay, next one. Moving to a whole new city at my age would be hard. Change talk or sustain talk? Yep, keep them coming. I'm seeing a lot of minuses so far in this one. Yeah, you got it. So this is definitely sustain talk. They're talking about ability again here, right? It would be difficult to do this. When's the last time you moved to a new city? It's hard. And I'm not sure I want to go through those challenges. So that's a minus. That's sustain talk. And I don't even want to think about the downsizing it would take. Change talk or sustain talk? I don't want to think about it. Downsizing is hard. Excellent. Yeah, you got it. These are minuses. This is sustain talk. Almost there. Home stretch here. And most of my friends live here. Most of my friends live here. Change talk or sustain talk? Yep. You got it. They're giving a reason why I don't want to move. All my friends live here. They don't live there. They live here. I get something beneficial out of the status quo. All right. Still, who knows what will happen as I get older? And it would be nice to be close to family. Change talk or sustain talk? See a couple pluses so far. Any minuses? Vicky Kiata, yeah. Okay, I see pluses. You're right. This is change talk. It would be nice to be with family. And then finally, the last one, this kind of rhetorical question that this person asks right at the end. What if they decided to move somewhere else? Do you see that as change talk or sustain talk? Yeah, I see a couple minuses so far. Yeah. Thanks, Khalil, for adding your 2 cents. You're right. That is sustained talk. So I know this was like a little bit, I don't know that people always kind of talk in this way, right? This is a very much like a monologue that was just happening. But it will be up to us to um, draw out from people all of this conversation, right? We need to be having people talk in these terms so that we can hear their change talk or sustain talk, so that we can hear their inner ambivalence um, being resolved, or at least we want to hear what it is, right? So that's our little exercise on listening to change talk. It's, I think, for me, one of the most crucial components of motivational interviewing. And I would like to see people be increasingly good at this task of categorizing what people say to them as both change talk, or as either change talk or sustain talk, right? All right. I think we have quite a bit more to get to, but I think I'd like to save a lot of this for next session because there's some really good stuff in here. Um, so maybe I'll just kind of move us to our next steps and our takeaways. You want to take away the takeaways, Colin?
Yes. So, first things first, ambivalence is very frustrating, can feel very frustrating in our workspaces, but it's just a normal part of change, right? Think about change in your own life. You likely felt good and not so great about some of the harder decisions you've made in your life before. Ambivalence can be resolved by exploring the client's own motivations and values, which I think in a nutshell is motivational interviewing, right? Resistance is an opportunity and a guide. Um, we want to view resistance as an opportunity, right? To do something to guide us in a specific direction that might be actually toward where the client wants to go. And we know this will happen through a collaborative process, right? And then we have that PACE acronym here in the end that says the spirit of MI involves collaboration through partnership, acceptance, compassion, and empowerment. And all those come with their own kind of skills, strategies, and tools. Next week, the next time we meet, we'll be able to talk about some of those things specifically, which should be really exciting. Give you all some opportunities to see what this looks like in practice.
Yeah. So here's some quick next steps that I want to give you. Actually, let me pause there. I have a couple of next steps that I want to give you, but we got 2 minutes left to the end. I wonder if there's any kind of questions that people are sitting with before we get on out of here. Are there questions or comments that people would like to have resolved? And maybe we can roll some of that into next week. So I'll just give a pause. If you have a question, now's a good time to ask it. Okay, and maybe as you're thinking about your questions, I'll keep us moving. Here's some next steps that we wanted to offer you. So as we get off of this call, we would love it if you would be so kind as to complete this session evaluation, which I'm dropping in the chat right now. There we go. Here's Heartset's session evaluation. The Coalition for the Homeless will offer their own evaluation as well. But we would love it if you wouldn't mind giving us some feedback on the session. And if you leave an email address in that, you will get a certificate of attendance as well as a copy of the slides from today. I'd like to also suggest to you that you maybe spend some time practicing in each of your client interactions in the coming week, identifying change talk and sustain talk. I don't think you need to sort of focus too much on like amplifying the change talk yet, and we want to give you some strategies for that if motivational interviewing is new to you. But just identifying it is a critical part of this formula. So be listening for change talk, be listening for sustain talk, and sharpen your ears for some of those things. All right, folks, we've reached the end. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and staying engaged and responding to us today. We really appreciate your time and your energy. I hope you have a great week. We will kick it off same time, same place next week with part 2 of this motivational interviewing series. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
You all take care.